So this morning we're going to talk about something I'm really excited to talk about. We're going to be talking about it for the next couple weeks as long as Russell's out and I'm up here. We're just going to keep going. We're going to be in the book of Philippians, so if you have a Bible with you, you can open up to the book of Philippians. And we're going to talk about joy. Joy is something that I love. Everyone wants to be joyful, right? Everyone wants to live a joyful life. And joy is something that I've always kind of strived for. It's something that I hope when people think of me, they think of joy. I hope that my life is defined by joy. Because I believe that joy, it might seem like this kind of silly, happy thing, but I believe that when we have true joy in our lives, it points to Jesus. Because I believe that true joy comes from Jesus and Jesus alone. And so I've had people... a lot of you guys know that we do YouTube. We upload videos all the time on YouTube. And we have people on YouTube say, hey, you and your family, you look so happy all the time. How? And I get to point them to Jesus. It's because of Jesus and the joy that he's given me. And I can look at my past, times in my life where I haven't been joyful. I lost my dad when I was really young, and I went through this really bad depression and just this kind of hopeless stage. But God pulled me through it to now go and live a life filled with joy. Growing up, I had a really bad learning disability. I have short-term memory loss, and I have dyslexia. And so school was just a nightmare for me. So through these things in my past, there's been so many times where joy was not something that defined my life. It was something, I had like the opposite of joy in my life. But God carried me through those times and taught me how even through hard times, we can still have joy. How even when we're maybe surrounded by people who are trying to steal our joy, we can still have joy. Even when there's things that we want, or we don't have enough stuff, or we can still have joy. And how through stress and worry we can still have joy. There's all these things in life that come to steal our joy. But Jesus offers us a joy that's unshakable. And so we're going to look into the book of Philippians and look at the life of Paul and look at the secret to finding this true joy. So if you guys have read the book of Philippians, it's awesome. Philippians is one of my favorite books. It's just 4 short chapters, but it's just a gold mine. It's one of those books that's filled with those little verses that everyone's quoting all the time, all the super encouraging verses that everyone goes to. Philippians is just a gold mine of that stuff. It's full of wisdom. It's full of encouragement. But there's one thing that Paul continually comes back to over and over again throughout these 4 short chapters, and that's joy. So for the next few weeks, however long we have together, we're going to look at that. We're going to look at this joy that Paul was talking about and see how we can have that unshakable, supernatural joy in our lives in a world that's filled with trouble, in a world that's constantly coming and trying to steal that joy from us. Doesn't that sound nice? An unshakable, supernatural joy. A joy that's not based off our circumstances or the people around us or the things we have or focused on everything going good. If we just had a true joy that was unshakable through every circumstance. Doesn't that sound awesome? Right? It's hard because we live in this world where circumstances are constantly thrown at us to steal our joy. There's constantly people coming into your life who are trying to steal your joy. We're surrounded by a world that's constantly got the bigger and the best thing that you gotta have, and you gotta make more money, and you gotta have the dream life, and you gotta drive a better car, and your house has got. All these things come to steal our joy, and then we have so much to stress and worry about, and there's all these things that we can put our thoughts onto. We live in a world that's just constantly trying to steal our joy. So this idea of an unshakable, supernatural joy like we see in the life of Paul, it seems almost like it's too good to be true, right? In our world here, my life, it seems like it's too good to be true. How can we have a joy that can't be stolen by negative circumstances? How can we have a joy that's not stolen by the people around us, by the want for the things that stress us out, for the things that make us worry? So, in the book of Philippians, Paul lays out exactly how we get this joy. He reveals this secret to having a true Christian joy. And so that's what we're going to talk about the next couple weeks. And this is going to be, it's going to be real. I'm not going to just say, because Jesus loves you. Now go and be happy. And bad things happen. Hey, but Jesus loves you. But I'm poor and I want all this stuff. Hey, Jesus loves you. No. Paul gives us a real strategy guide here of how when things go bad, how we can still have joy. When bad people come into your life, how you can still have joy. How we can overcome these desires of the flesh and the want for things, and how we can overcome the things that stress us out, and how we can overcome the things that make us worry to have this sustaining joy. That's what we're going to look at over the next couple weeks. A real strategy, a real plan of how we can obtain and sustain this real joy, this unshakable joy in a world that's constantly coming and trying to steal it from you. See, we have an enemy who's real, who wants to make your life joyless. He wants to steal. He wants to kill. He wants to destroy. Joy is not what he wants your life to be defined by. So he throws all these things at us to steal our joy, because ultimately our joy points us to Jesus. Our joy points us to where joy comes from. It comes from God. And so the enemy, he wants to steal your joy. He wants to take it from you because he knows that it points to Jesus. So we're going to look at, over the next couple weeks, these couple different things and how we can overcome them to sustain that true joy. So one little thing before we get started. A lot of times when you think about joy, most people think like a happy feeling. But there's a big difference between happiness and joy. See, happiness is more like a temporary feeling, right? Something good happens, you feel happy. So it's usually directly related to the circumstances around us. If things are going good, we feel happy, right? If things are going bad, we don't feel happy. So some things that make me happy. Hockey. I love to watch hockey, especially when the Panthers win. Doesn't happen too often these days. So it's a good thing my joy is not anchored in the Panthers' success. But yeah, watching hockey makes me happy. When I upload a video on YouTube, it gets a lot of views. That makes me happy. Let's see. This is a good one. You know, have you ever find like a $20 bill in your pocket that you didn't know was there, and you're like, I'm rich, right? I mean, it's your money. You had it all along, but you kind of feel like, hey, I just found some money. That makes me happy. Pizza makes me happy. Like having good pizza, that's happiness right there. Going on vacations, hanging out with my family. Those are some things that make me happy, right? When those things happen, I'm happy. The Panthers win. Woohoo! I feel good. I'm happy. I got a good slice of pizza. Woohoo! I'm happy. But that doesn't bring my life joy. See, joy is more than just that happiness that's based off of whatever's currently happening. Joy is more of a lifestyle. It's something more than just a feeling. It's not something we feel. It's more something that we have. When we look to the Bible, it talks about having joy, not feeling joy or being happy. It talks about joy as something that we have. Joy is something that we have to choose. It's a choice that we have to choose to have that joy. And we have to choose to praise God through the different situations in life. So the best way I can think to kind of describe joy is like the opposite. The opposite of joy is depression. You know what depression is? Depression isn't just sad, right? Sad's like, oh, I bumped my foot. Oh, I'm sad. I got hurt, right? Sadness is based off of the current circumstances, but depression is like that kind of gloomy, funky feeling that floats around you like that cloud that's always raining on you. You know Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh? Oh, bother, right? He just had that cloud that followed him around, and he was always sad no matter what happened. It's not just a sad feeling, but it's like an abiding sadness, right? And so joy is the opposite of that. Joy is that abiding happiness. Depression is that abiding sadness. Joy is that abiding happiness. When you look at depression, there might be moments of happiness. There might be happiness here and there. But overall, it's like that gloomy, funky feeling of hopelessness. And it's faithless and it's fearful, right? Joy is the opposite of that. It's that abiding sense of happiness. And when the Bible talks about joy, it's not about that feeling, something we feel, but when Paul talks about it, he's talking about something that he has and something that you can have. So I want to go with a new definition of joy. The definition that we're going to be talking about for the next couple weeks, I think of joy. Joy is having contentment and peace in God, regardless of the circumstances, the people, the things, the stress, and the worry. Joy is having that peace and contentment in God, regardless of what's happening around us. So let's dive in. Let's look to the book of Philippians. If you got a Bible with you, you can open up to Philippians chapter 1, and we're just going to go chapter by chapter over the next couple weeks. So the book of Philippians, a little bit of a background on it. So Philippians was written by the Apostle Paul, and he wrote it actually while he was a prisoner in Rome around AD 62. And so he wrote this letter to the church at Philippi, which is a church that he founded when he was on his second missionary journey. And so looking at the life of Paul, where he was at this point, he had this dream. He had this dream to go to Rome as a missionary for years. And he wrote about this in various different letters about this desire he had to go to Rome. He wanted to go to Rome, and he wanted to preach the gospel because Rome was the biggest empire in the world at the time. And so he had that desire to go to the biggest empire in the world and just and bring Christ and preach Christ there and just see this nation come to Christ. And so he's got this big dream. I'm going to go to the biggest the biggest empire in the world, and I'm just going to go preach Christ. And so he's fired up, he's excited, and bam, he's thrown in jail. So here's Paul, and he just gets his dreams ripped right out from under him, and he's thrown in jail. And it was a good dream. I mean, he wanted to go reach these people with the gospel, and it's ripped out from under him. That's got to feel just discouraging. But when we look, Paul responds by writing this book of Philippians. And what's really, I guess, unusual about this book is that it's all about joy, right? You look at Paul, and he's living for God, and he's doing what he believes God is calling him to do, going to Rome to preach the gospel, and he's thrown in prison. But he responds by writing this book all about joy. So, like I said, Philippians is only 4 chapters long, but in those 4 chapters, he uses the word joy 19 times. And he also mentions things like rejoicing and gladness. And this whole book has just got this theme of joy all throughout it. So Paul writes this book all about joy at a time that when you look to his life, it seems like he has no reason at all to have joy. He has no reason to be happy. He's in chains, and I don't know if you guys know what Roman prison's like, but it's not exactly like the Holiday Inn. This is bad stuff here. I mean, he is chained. He's in chains. He's in a Roman prison in these terrible living conditions, and he's awaiting his trial, where he could possibly be sentenced to be beheaded. And it said that even the Christians in Rome were outspokenly against Paul. Like, Paul, what are you doing? And so if anyone had a reason not to be joyful, it's Paul, right? He's got his dreams ripped out from under him. He's in this nasty Roman prison. Everything's going bad for him. So if anyone has a reason not to have joy, it's Paul. But despite all of this horrible situation, Paul is just overflowing with joy. He just writes this book about how he's just overflowing with joy, and it's like, what? how? Why? Why are you overflowing with joy? You should be mad. I'm thinking if I'm in prison and I did nothing wrong and I'm writing a book to my church, to you guys, I'm going to be like, you guys got to come bust me out. Like, right? But he writes this book all about joy. In this horrible situation, he writes this book about this joy he has. And he reveals the secret of how to obtain it and how to sustain it. So I told you that he uses the word joy 19 times, but there's another thing that he continues to repeat throughout these 4 chapters. He uses the word mind 10 times, and he uses the word think 5 times. And so Paul is telling us that the secret to obtaining this joy is through our mindset. It's from the way the believer thinks, through the way we set our mind on things. The secret to obtaining and sustaining these joys, this joy is through the mindset that we have. And so this letter, he goes through and explains the different mindsets that the believer needs to have if they are going to have this true joy in a world filled with trouble. So for the next couple weeks, we're going to look and see what these mindsets are. We're going to look into Philippians and see how do we obtain this supernatural, unshakable joy. And we're going to look at 4 things that Satan places in our lives to try and steal our joy. Our circumstances, the people, the things, and stress and worry. These 4 things that Satan throws in our lives, these 4 joy thieves that come and try and steal our joy. And then we're going to look at the 4 mindsets that Paul says that we use to overcome these things. These are real, practical things that if you take this and apply it to your life, it's going to work. I can say that with confidence because I've seen how it's worked in my life. I've seen how it's worked in other people's lives. And this is the secret to this true joy that Paul has. So let's dive right into Philippians, right in Philippians 1. Starting in verse 3, Paul says, I thank God every time I remember you. In all my prayers for all of you, I always pray with joy because your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to the completion until the day of Christ Jesus. So Paul starts this book by saying it's bringing him joy as he thinks about his friends and he thinks about his disciples back at home. That even in the midst of this terrible situation, Paul starts his letter by saying, hey, I'm praying for you guys. I'm just filled with joy thinking about you guys. Isn't that amazing? In the midst of these bad situations, Paul is joyfully praying for his church. It's amazing. So when we look at Paul, we see that he's completely selfless. Paul's completely selfless, and he's always thinking of others. And it's funny because you can look and see how he's literally living out the words that he wrote. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself. Paul's thrown in prison, and he's like, hey, I'm praying for you guys. I'm so joyful just thinking about you guys. Now, this might seem like kind of like a elementary Sunday school analogy, but just hang with me. So joy, J-O-Y. Have you guys ever heard this before? Jesus, others, yourself. Have you heard that before? It's kind of that cute little thing. It's easy to teach to kids. But when we look at Paul, I mean, that's what he was doing. That's how he's living his life. Jesus was number 1 in his life. Nothing could take that place of Christ in his life. Nothing could hold him back from fulfilling that mission that he felt God was calling him to do. That even when he's thrown in prison and has his dreams ripped out from under him, he doesn't question God. He still has peace and still filled with joy because of this trust that he has. And he's fully just pursuing Jesus regardless of the circumstance. And then he starts his letter by praying for others. He's praying for his church back at home. So others were second in his life. And so himself, he was last. He was third. And like I said, I'd be like, come bust me out. What? The first thing you write is that he's praying for other people. It's pretty amazing. So let's keep reading. Picking up in verse 12. He said, now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened has actually served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. What? You read this and it's like Paul's crazy or something. Paul had this mindset that he could look at this situation where his dreams are crushed, he's thrown in prison, and then the very next thing he says is, this is great. This is great. This has turned out so much better. Right? I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened has actually served to advance the gospel. He says that I came here to preach the gospel to the biggest empire in the world, but now I'm thrown in prison, and this has just turned out so much better. What? How can you say this? You just got your dreams ripped out from under you. But he looks at his situation and says, this is better. How? It came from his mindset. When we look at Paul, he was single-minded. He had a single-minded commitment to the gospel. His only mission was to spread the word of Jesus. He had a single-minded commitment. So his dream is to go to Rome to preach the gospel, but then he's thrown in prison. Guess what? It didn't change. Nothing changed. Now he preaches the gospel here. And he says that now this has worked out better. Because through my terrible circumstances, people have seen the joy that I've had. And it's become clear that I am in chains because of Christ. It's worked out better for me this way. All because of Paul's mindset, that he could look at this terrible situation, these horrible circumstances, being in chains, and saying, these chains are used to advance the gospel. Paul had a single-minded commitment. His one purpose was to spread the gospel, to share the love of Jesus. See, Paul trusted God so much with his life that even when he's thrown in prison, he believes that this is what God has for me. God has put me here with a purpose. He had this single-minded commitment, spread the gospel. Even when he's thrown in prison, he still has that one mission, spread the gospel. He didn't let his circumstances change his purpose. Paul's chains actually allowed him to preach to multiple guards each day. He was always chained up to these guards, and so he'd be preaching the gospel. He's sharing about this joy that he has that comes from Jesus, right? Imagine you're a guard in a Roman prison, and you're chained to this guy who's just like, oh, man, I was coming here to talk to everyone about Jesus, but now I'm thrown in prison, and this is just working out great because now I get to talk to You're going to be like, you are crazy. But these people start seeing that is not fake, that he's not a lunatic, he's not crazy. This guy has real joy. And then they start looking at their own lives and say, I want that. I look at my life, I'm discontent, and nothing's ever good enough, and I look for joy here and there, and I never find it. And here's this guy, chained up in prison, overflowing with joy, writing these letters to his friends back at home saying, man, this is so great. I'm in the prison. I'm getting to talk to everyone about Jesus. I'm praying for you guys. And then everyone's like, I want that. I want that. So then it starts becoming clear that he's in chain for Christ. And so the gospel starts spreading throughout this prison. So Paul just keeps overflowing with joy. He just keeps sharing the gospel. And because of his chains, God got to use him in amazing ways. And see, Paul had that single-minded commitment. He was so content and so trusting in God that he believed that even if he was in prison, that was exactly what God had for him. This is exactly where you want me, God. Thanks for bringing me here. And it seems crazy, but when you look to his life, he just overflowed with joy. He overcame his circumstances, and God used him to accomplish amazing things. That in this prison, he writes this book all about joy that's still changing lives 2,000 years later. He just had this peace, knowing that God was sovereign, He's sovereign over everything. He's completely in control. So I just have this single-minded commitment. I'm just going to share his love, and I'm going to spread his gospel no matter where I go. So when I think about this story and this mindset that Paul had, there's one person from kind of our age who really stands out to me, and that's Bethany Hamilton. Do you guys know who Bethany Hamilton is? The soul surfer. I'll tell you all about her. You guys don't? Most of you know? How many people know? Okay, good. So Bethany Hamilton, she was a young, up-and-coming surfer. She was 13 years old, and she got her arm bitten off by a shark. And so when you look to Paul, he had his dreams ripped out from under him. And the same thing happens to Bethany. She's this amazing surfer. She's starting to get all these sponsorship deals with really big surf companies. And she's starting to compete, starting to win all these championships. And so she has this really big, bright future to be one of the best surfers in the world. Shark comes and bites off her arm. She just has those dreams ripped out from under her. So there she is. She's got all these sponsorships. I'm probably not going to get my sponsorships. And I had this great life. But Bethany didn't let her circumstances steal her joy. 1 month later, she started surfing again. And she got back on the board and started to learn to surf with one arm, which, how many of you guys have surfed before? It's exhausting, right? You got to paddle all the way out there to the surf. You got to turn around, wait for the wave to come. You got to paddle, and then stand up, and then ride the wave, and then go back and do it again. Surfing is exhausting, and imagine doing that with one arm. And so she has these dreams, being this big professional surfer, and all these sponsorship deals, and she's just got her whole life set out ahead of her. Shark comes and steals it all away. But she decided that she wasn't going to let her circumstances steal her joy. She wasn't going to sit around and feel bad for herself. She goes out there and starts learning to surf again. And she went on and lived out her dream. She became one of the best surfers in the world. She's won countless surfing competitions. But through all this, she's pointed to Jesus. People looked at her life and felt bad. Oh, man, this up-and-coming surfer bit by a shark. But she never let her circumstances steal her joy. So she learns to surf again. She goes on, wins all these surfing competitions, becomes one of the best surfers in the world. But because of her circumstances, Jesus was magnified through her life. She was able to do amazing things. She wrote a book. They made a movie about her. She made an I Am Second video. She actually is now married. She's pregnant with her second child. Her and her husband were on The Amazing Race. She got to do all of these amazing things because of her circumstance, because people looked at her and said, "How did you overcome this?" And she said, "Because of Jesus." How did you overcome this and not let this circumstance steal your joy? Because of Jesus. And so Bethany, instead of saying, "Oh, man, I'm never going to surf again," she said, "I lost my arm for the gospel." She had that same single-minded commitment. Okay, God, if you want me to be a professional surfer, great, but I'm going to use this for your glory. I just don't know, if I look to my own life, man, if I were to, have my dreams ripped out from under me, would I just say, "Hey, this is great. God's going to use this for his glory"? Because of her negative circumstances, God used it in a huge way. She viewed her negative circumstances as a positive opportunity. And her circumstances gave her all these opportunities to share Christ and to show Jesus to the world. And so the secret is that when you have this single-minded commitment, when you have that single-minded commitment, when you have negative circumstances, you view them as God-given opportunities. Paul, thrown in prison, he views it as a God-given opportunity to spread the gospel. Bethany Hamilton has her arm bit off by a shark. She sees it as a God-given opportunity. And Christ was magnified through their response to their negative circumstances. So we got to have that single-minded commitment and rejoice in what God is doing instead of complaining about the things he didn't do. So let's keep reading in verse 21. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I am to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me. And I do not know which to choose. But I am hard pressed from both directions, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, for that is very much better, yet to remain on in the flesh is more necessary for your sake. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you for all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that your proud confidence in me may abound in Christ Jesus through the coming to you again. Because of Paul's chains, Christ was preached. And because of his response to his negative circumstances, Jesus was magnified. His joy was contagious. When people looked at the negative circumstances in his life and they saw that unshakable joy that he had, they looked at his life and said, that's what I need. I need that. They saw this. He has no reason to have joy, but he just radiates it. When non-believers look to our lives and they see the way that we respond to negative circumstances, it is a God-given opportunity for us to point the world to Jesus. When people see the way we overcome these negative circumstances in our lives, Christ can be magnified. See, Paul, he's saying, man, I'd rather just depart and go be with Christ. But if I'm going to live on and continue to be here in the flesh, I'm going to magnify him. I want to go be with Jesus, but I know I still have a mission to fulfill. He continues in verse 27, whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come to see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel. Paul is encouraging us to do what he did. Whatever happens, whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel. Whatever happens in your life, use it to point to Jesus. Use it to magnify Christ. Bad things are going to happen. I'm sorry. I've been talking all about joy. I got to tell you something. Bad things are going to happen to you. I'm sorry. No, Jesus said it. I'm not saying it. Jesus said it. John 16:33 says, in this world you will have troubles, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus tells us it's not going to be all rainbows and butterflies. Bad things are going to happen. But if you have that single-minded commitment to God, if you have that peace in knowing that he is sovereign over everything and that he is ultimately in control of our lives, we can use our negative circumstances to point to Jesus, to magnify him. James 1 verse 8 says, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. Paul saw his chains as a positive opportunity because he had a single-minded commitment to the gospel. So let joy be our witness. Let our joy be the thing that points to Jesus. Let's live our lives joyful. So when people look to our lives and say, man, what is it about you? You seem to be happy all the time. It's Jesus. It's Jesus. So I want to close with one last story, one last example. I talked about Paul. I talked about Bethany Hamilton, about how these people use their negative circumstances to not feel bad about themselves, but to use it to point to Jesus and to magnify Christ. One last example is Jesus himself. Isaiah 53 verse 3 says this. He was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised, and we did not care. That's pretty rough. But when you look to the life of Jesus, he possessed this deep joy that was beyond anything the world had to offer. And as he faces this cruel death on a cross, Jesus says to his disciples in John 15:11, he says, "These things I have spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full." Jesus, facing this horrible death on a cross, says this to his disciples. Hebrews 12, verse 1 and 2 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith." And get this, "For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning his shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. Jesus, God in the flesh, creator of the universe, sovereign over everything, left his perfect home in heaven to come to earth, lives a perfect, sinless life. He was despised. He was rejected. He was mocked, and then he's whipped and beaten and hung on a cross. And he did all this for the joy set before him. He did this so that we could have joy, so that this joy could remain in us and that our joy would be full. Through Jesus, we can have that true joy. Through Jesus, we have victory. Through Jesus, we have freedom. So let us to not live like prisoners anymore. Let's not live like slaves. Let's not live like Eeyore. For the joy set before him, he went to the cross. He did it for you. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. He went to the cross knowing how cruel it would be. And he did it with joy because he knew that his suffering meant that his relationship with you could be restored. And he did it for the joy set before him. He did that for us. So let us not respond by living our lives like Eeyore. Let us live a life full with joy. Let us to have that single-minded commitment to sharing his love. Let us to switch this view of our negative opportunities to be able to see them as God-given opportunities. Let us to understand that God is sovereign. He's in control. He's never going to leave us. He's never going to forsake us. So that even when we find ourselves in the prison, we can still radiate with joy. Negative circumstances are going to come into your life to try and steal your joy. But take on that mindset of Paul. Trust in God in that way, believing that he is sovereign, knowing that he's never going to leave you, that he's never going to turn his back on you, and have that same single-minded commitment to the gospel. And let's use our chains as positive opportunities to magnify Christ to the world. Let me pray for us. Jesus, we just love you and thank you for the opportunity we have to have joy. Jesus, we know that you are the source of joy. God, we live in a world where true joy is rare. So God, let us to understand this. God, that through you we can live a truly joyful life. And that when we have that joy, we can magnify you to the world. We can point the world to you. God, I pray that when we find ourselves in negative circumstances, that we would have that single-minded commitment. Just like Paul, even as he has his dreams ripped out from under him, he can see that as a positive opportunity to magnify you. Just like Bethany Hamilton, as she has her arm bitten off by a shark. God, we know that you used that negative circumstance to bring tons of people to you, that she could magnify you to the world. So God, I pray that we would have that same heart, that we would trust you, that we know that you're not going to turn your back on us. So even when we find ourselves in negative circumstances, we would have peace in knowing that, God, you can use that you can use us through the way we respond to magnify you to the world. Jesus, I just pray that you would allow us to take on this mindset so that we can have true joy. In Jesus' name, amen.